I was so kind of just floored. I'm like, I can't believe that people are talking like this. Like, did we not learn anything from reducing people to the color of their skin? Like, how is this not the most regret? I can't believe this is happening again. And when I would see people posting things on Twitter and, hearing things I'm like, this is going to be studied, because in 100 years, if we're still around, people are going to look back and they're going to be looking at this and they're going to be like, I can't believe Americans did that again.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. You may notice that I'm a few days late getting out this podcast episode. That's because the one I was going to post, which was recorded on October 5th, suddenly seemed sort of not right, considering what happened in Israel on October 7th, not to mention the whole situation over there since then. I'm still working on trying to find someone to talk about that situation specifically, and I don't really want to do that until we can back up from it at least a few feet. But insofar as there's been a lot of interest in the response to the attacks, especially the response on college campuses, I thought I would bring in someone who talks very insightfully about that. He is Ben Appel. Ben is a writer living in New York who started writing about these issues a couple of years ago. You may remember an article he wrote in Newsweek in April of 2022 called "The New Homophobia," where he talked about the way the new gender movement sometimes takes gay people and fits them into a transgender box, all in the service of the same stereotypes that progressives spent so many years fighting. Anyway, we're going to talk about that kind of stuff in the bonus portion of this episode for paying subscribers. In the main version, we're going to talk about how this anti-Semitism has arisen over the last decade or so on campuses. I think it really snuck up on a lot of people. And Ben has some really insightful and interesting things to say about that. He was a student at Columbia University in his 30s, and he's now writing a book about that experience. And this is a really great conversation, quite timely, I think. So here it is. Ben Appel, welcome to The Unspeakable.
Thanks, Meghan.
We're recording this on October 16th, so we're a little more than a week past the massacre in Israel by Hamas. A lot has transpired since then. There's a war going on. The episode I had ready to go for this week wasn't exactly on a totally trivial subject, but it didn't feel right to post it so soon. I'm not going to have a geopolitical discussion about Israel and Palestine here, unless you want to.
I'm good.
Surprise. But I think that one thing that very much folds into what we talk about around here is the response to the attacks by progressive groups in general and on college campuses specifically. I wanted to bring you in basically for a reality check. Let's start here. How closely does campus activism resemble what we're seeing on places like TikTok and Twitter? Are conservatives and centrist types making too much of this?
Oh, yeah. No, they're not. It's pretty accurate, I would say. I mean, even when I was I graduated from Columbia in 2020. And just for your listeners to clarify, like now I'm 40. I was in my 30s when I went to the school, because I had not earned my undergraduate degree years ago. I had dropped out of college, and then I went back to school, and they have a program there for non-traditional students, like people who have taken breaks in their undergraduate course level. I was there for 3.5 years in my 30s. And I do remember even like maybe my second year there, just kind of being really shocked. It was a culture shock. I was so, amped up to be part of this radically progressive, liberal, community, so psyched about it. I was devastated by Donald Trump's election, and I was just ready and raring to go. And then what I encountered there was this very odd, conformist, creepy cult-like culture. And I said, to answer your question, from like the second year, that it felt like an extension of a Twitter feed, that Columbia itself was a Twitter feed. You could scroll through it, and that's kind of what you would find on campus. Everything, it just bounced off each other.
Okay. And you're talking about everything, because one of the things we hear is like, oh, you guys are just focusing on liberal arts and the humanities. And you're talking about not only are you only talking about elite colleges, you're talking about these very specific departments. This can't possibly be happening in engineering and in hard sciences. Is that true?
Well, so I was a humanities scholar there. So I was, studying writing, and I was taking a lot of, but the thing about Columbia is that it does pride itself, and I think it's a great aspect of the university, is that it prides itself on what's called its core curriculum. So, regardless of the academic path, the discipline that people, regardless of major, students are all required to take courses in the arts and the humanities. For arts and humanities scholars, they have to take classes in the sciences and math and statistics, et cetera. So part of their curriculum is getting a really well-rounded education. So you're not just, if you go in and if you're part of the Cis school, which is like the School of Engineering, you're not just sequestered in there. I mean, obviously, most of your classes, especially in your later years, are going to be, that. But throughout the entire time that you're there, you're really kind of engaging across disciplines. And so it is, everybody encounters it. It's not just in the arts and humanities.
Can you just talk about what was happening in the classroom for you? Can you give some examples?
Yeah. Oh, sure. So it's tricky because it's hard to describe situations where things happen and they can be really subtle. There's like really subtle energy shifts and changes in the room, and it's hard to kind of articulate. It wasn't like these like major occurrences that happened where, suddenly someone was screaming at somebody. It was just a culture of, I just knew I knew I was self-censoring, and I knew that other people were too. And on campus, there was this idea about like, oh, it's all about self-care, and it's okay to not be okay. And there had been, unfortunately, some suicides reported. Mental illness, mental health was a big thing. Stress culture was a big topic that people talked about on Columbia's campus. And I kind of was like, honestly, I know that it's so much of the pressure of the rigorous academic stuff that we're doing. I know that there's just a lot going on, but I also was like, I know that people are stressed out because they're terrified. They can't sleep because they're terrified. They're up late and they're wondering, what could I say, or what about this? It was because the repercussions, the consequences were so severe to be exiled. And you were saying like, how accurate is it on Twitter? I think that, in social media, TikTok, et cetera, when that was, 2017, after Trump was inaugurated, we saw all of this kind of cancel culture stuff kind of starting to take off online. And in that way too, it really mirrored the campus, because nobody at college, especially when you're younger, and you're coming in, you're 18, 19, 20, 21, you don't want to be known as some kid on campus that said the wrong thing in class, and everybody knows about it, and suddenly you're just an exile. And then they saw that, and then it wasn't just like, oh well, everybody on campus might hear it. It's like, obviously it's going to be online, people are going to tweet about it and post about it, and then it's just going to it was like the consequences of it were just so overwhelming, and understandably so. I mean, it's terrifying. So, there was so much at stake, and the stakes were so high to stay in line and to say and to speak the right thing. So at that time, I remember, I had taken, and again, Meghan, I'm like this progressive, excited, I'm protesting with the kids in, my first semester against the Muslim ban. I interned for GLAAD my first year, was just on board with all of it. But I remember what really shocked me was I was just a cis white guy. First of all, I didn't know what cisgender meant at the time.
Yeah, we should say, is that how you pronounce it? Cis? I thought it was cis.
I know everybody was there like, why do you say cis? I'm like, I don't even know. Cis.
Cis, I mean, sorry, it sounds like sissy, which
It's
is
it's
like the
awful.
opposite.
It's
I
the
just, I
worst.
mean,
It sounds
but
like hissing. It sounds like it's
how about,
just
it should be six. Like, well, can you be cis X?
yeah, yes. Yeah, maybe that's what I'll say.
Yeah, you're a cis white guy, but I mean, we should say you are a gay
Well, I'm
guy.
a gay guy. So this is the thing. So I had worked in marriage equality campaign, like volunteered for that in Maryland back in 2012. I had worked after that. I had volunteered for like a pro transgender rights legislation campaign in Maryland. And that was kind of really what sparked my decision to go back to school. So like, I'm a gay guy, but when I went on camp, I'm not very obviously gay all the time. I don't genuflect all the time. I don't, I maybe, quote unquote straight acting, I suppose. Like and I think that being a little bit older and being like, it didn't matter. I think people just saw me as a straight white guy, right? Especially being a little bit older, they could tell I was a little bit older. So they're like, oh, he's probably a GS student. And a lot of GS students are are veterans
What's
because
GS?
I'm sorry, the School of General Studies is the school that non-traditional program
Okay.
that I was in. And so there's three schools on campus. There's CEAS, which is the engineering school. There's CC, Columbia College, which is like the regular, college that the kids go to. And then there's General Studies, which is people that are all different ages, but that have had a break in their academic careers and come back. So a lot of them are like ballerinas, actors, veterans, have really interesting different kinds of stories, and everybody is matriculated in together. Everybody takes classes together. There's also Barnard. So Barnard is a Columbia affiliated school, and that's the women's school. So really, students from all four of these schools are taking classes together. So your classes can be with Barnard students, the C students, CC students, and then GS students who could be up to like 60 or 67 years old, or it can be like a 22-year-old or 19. All that you need to do to get into that school or qualify for admissions is to, I think, have a year-long break in your studies.
Okay.
To get into it. So I was this older guy, so I think a lot of them maybe thought, oh, he might be a veteran because it had a lot of we had a lot of mil vets in the school, because general studies was actually, it started before then, but it really ramped up after the Second World War. For a lot of GIs, they kind of started this specific program to allow veterans to continue their educations after being disrupted by
Columbia did specifically, you're saying?
Columbia did specifically, right?
Okay.
So it still has that legacy. There's just a lot of mil vets that come there. So in class, it was almost like I just learned really quickly that I kind of had to start qualifying, as a gay man, or, as, like, I mean,
you were leaning on anything you had.
Right. I would joke because I'm taking classes that, have to do with gender and sexuality and human rights. And if I would volunteer a thought, it was like, it's all about identity, and it's all about identitarianism and identity politics, essentially. And so everybody's just viewed and judged by these superficial, these, immutable characteristics. And you kind of look someone up and down, and when they open their mouth to speak, if it's this cis white guy, you're expecting it to be, less than woke. And then if it is woke enough, you're pleasantly surprised. And if it's not, then it's your job to call it out and to say, oh, and that was the attitude. And that was that was what it was like. The first kind of like small run-in I had was I had taken my first semester a class called Contemporary Islamic Civilization. And that was taught by a guy named Hamid Deashi, and he's a controversial figure on campus. And he's an Iranian American, and but I really wanted to learn about Islam. I wanted to learn about Islamic civilization and culture, and just really educate myself. And there was discussion sections, like lab discussion sections for the class. And in that class, we were talking about gender and sexuality in the Muslim world, and I think Iran specifically. And, someone had mentioned how, and I think the TA was saying that, a lot of times, men who are very effeminate are really harassed by Iran's morality police, and that they have a lot of a harder time women who are really butch or masculine, they certainly are as well. But the men are, for some reason, more visible and are given a harder time. And I said, that has a lot to do with sexism and misogyny, that for men who are behaving effeminately, they're kind of degrading themselves, by being like women. Whereas with women, if they're butch, it's like, of course, it's not acceptable. Women are supposed to behave in a certain way. But in some cultures or some societies, sometimes it's interpreted as, not as bad. Women might have it a little bit easier in that regard, because men aren't supposed to behave like women. And this young woman, her hand shot up and she said, there's nothing easier about being a woman in society. And just, really kind of went off on what I said, which is a fundamentally, like, I don't know, I think it's a pretty feminist perspective, but I guess I did use the word easier somewhere in there, suggesting, and she just latched onto that and just had it. And nobody said anything. Everybody was quiet. And the TA just looked at me and he was like, all right, well, let's just move on. And I was so floored stunned because first of all my closest friends have always been women. I was raised by a single woman. My mom, she divorced my dad when I was 12. I have 2 older sisters. All my friends have always been women. I'm just a gay guy that has a lot of girlfriends. So to be kind of accused, like in front of a big class, of kind of saying something that wasn't adequately pro-woman was really startling to me. So after class, I walked up to her and I said, hey, I'm Ben. I said, I was just curious, like, what was it about that I said specifically that you had found, offensive or wrong? And she kind of looked at me and she just was exasperated. And she was like, I don't know. What did you say again? Like, she didn't even know.
I thought she was going to say, it's not my job to educate you.
Right. Well, yeah. And it was also like, she wasn't even listening. She just heard some part of this. To me, this is how I interpreted it was. And this is to answer your question in a very long-winded way, like, what was it like in class? It was just like, this is how I started to see, like, I am a cis white guy. So when I open my mouth, I just have to expect this kind of really bad faith interpretation of whatever comes out of my mouth, even if it's like the most progressive thing you can say. And that was really the beginning of starting to see, there's something going on here where I'm not in at all. I am out. First I have to qualify myself as a gay guy, because if I'm gay, then that's not so bad. But then before long, I was like, oh, wait, I have to be queer. I can't just be gay. I can't be a cis gay. Cis gays are horrible. Cis gays are in some ways worse than straight white guys. Like, good Lord, there's just this animosity. And that was where that's kind of,
Yeah. I want to talk about the difference between queer and gay in a few minutes. But I'm curious, like, in this class, what do you think would have happened if the professor had been there, not the TA?
Well,
because a lot of what we're hearing is like these kids are being radicalized or just, educated in certain ways by the professors. It's not like they're picking this stuff up from each other necessarily or from online. It's like, this is the curriculum. So like, we're seeing, I want to talk about what we've seen in the last week with regard to, the situation in Israel and the, free Palestine signage everywhere. That's coming straight down from the top in a lot of cases.
So here's the thing. These students are being indoctrinated with really radical, honestly, anti-Western, anti-American. There's really no easier way to say it. It's just blatantly anti-Western, anti-American views, that really are. And certainly professors are espousing these ideas. Absolutely. Especially in specific classes where post-colonial theories are a predominant lens through which these things are discussed. Queer theory, gender studies classes, absolutely. These critical theory courses are very much about that. They are, there's this gay historian, Richter Norton, who said something like, he wrote something once where it's like, this kind of socialist critical theory education, it's not about, discovering or creating new knowledge. It's about creating social change. It's not about, getting smarter per se, or really studying the facts. Facts are kind of irrelevant because there's no objective reality when it comes to postmodernism, and everybody, it's just all about positionality, like how everybody sees, things. And of course, then certain perspectives get privileged over the other ones. The more marginalized you are, the more your perspective is privileged, and the more immune you are to criticism for whatever views you have. So, yes, they are being indoctrinated with this, but it also does have a lot to do with TAs, because TAs are coming out of these programs but it's not just that, because there were professors. When I look back and I see, yes, there were professors who were saying some crazy stuff, but it wasn't just the professors themselves. It was almost like, I don't think they understood how radical and how, what's the word? Explosive the readings that they were assigning and teaching, these ideas that were just fundamentally at their core really cynical and pessimistic about the liberal world order and about Western civilization. And so there were it was almost like the professors, a lot of them were really kind of in the crossfire too, because it's really a red guard. I mean, it's a red guard. There's really no other way but to say it. It's this red guard of students who are in class, and it's almost like, because administrations have grown so dramatically in the past, especially like 10 years, and faculties have shrunk. So it's this bloated bureaucracy, these bloated administrations of DEI and multicultural affairs and all of these people. And it's like almost like the administration and the students against the faculty. But then, of course, there's all of this stuff that a lot of the professors are teaching. So they love it. They love the administration but what I've realized is that a lot of what's coming into this is a lot of these educators, and especially administrators, are being educated in these schools, these education schools. Teachers College at Columbia is one of them.
Right.
And they're really not learning how to be really fantastic teachers. They're learning how to be social justice advocates and how to train social justice warriors. That's essentially what it is. So the requirements aren't very rigorous to get into these schools, and people's pay depends on having advanced degrees, so they are guaranteed raises for this. So there's just a huge cost benefit.
But I want to understand, when you said before that it's the administrators and the students against the faculty, say more about that.
Yeah, so administrations on universities have exploded. I mean, by the tens of thousands. I mean, they've just grown and grown and grown, and schools spend millions or even billions of dollars on hiring all of these special new positions, especially like in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all these different administrators. And so what's interesting is that, these students are very much like, oh, bring down the patriarchy. They're very much about getting professors fired for, being jerks and, all of this stuff. And yet they are so dependent on the administration. The administration coddles them and babies them and, is so involved in their, lives. It's almost like this, they don't realize how paternalistic and how kind of really truly patriarchal this kind of system is.
And it's almost like the administrators have become the parents.
They absolutely have become the parents, Meghan. That's exactly what it is. And I feel like with a lot of these young people, and of course, this is not everyone, but this is kind of like the trend, is that a lot of these students are very, very privileged. They're very smart. They've been, reared to eventually attend an Ivy League university like Columbia. And the administration is kind of like like you said, an extension of their parents, where they want the guidance and the protection and they resent it at the same time. So it's like, it's this weird, however they feel about their parents, oh gosh, I can't stand my mom, but also, can I have a new iPhone? And then it's like, oh, these administrators, but also this person just said something a little bit offensive to me and I can't take it. You need to do something about it, that kind of thing. I mean, I went,
Wow. So they're going to the administrators for something as small as that. Like they will go into somebody's office, like the dean of students or whatever.
well, they have a bias reporting,
Right. Right.
system there. I mean, it's where you can say, I mean, you're reporting bias. Like, you hear
Yeah.
someone say something and you say, oh, this person is clearly, and you can report it. And then there can be like education session, essentially struggle sessions, where there can be mediation, between students and that's scary, that's scary.
I want to understand. Yeah. I mean, I want to understand though, like, in terms of the curriculum and in terms of the professors, where are they getting, for instance, the idea that Israel is an evil colonizer and that there's no debate and that Palestine needs to be freed? And these are the most, these reductive terms define the argument. Like, where is this coming from? Like when we started seeing these demonstrations and this blatant anti-Semitism over the last few weeks, what was your reaction? I mean, Columbia University is, I think, like just under 25% Jewish, the population on campus, students and
Well,
faculty
that
as
was
well.
going on when I was there. I remember during my orientation, like going out to eat with a couple people and them talking about, signs for like about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Maybe there was like a protest or something like that, or there's all of these groups calling for divestment of Israel. And I was very ignorant about this. I was kind of like, as far as I knew, Democratic platforms, they've always been like pro-Israel, just like Republican platforms have been, but it was kind of like, it seemed like the liberal thing to support Israel. I knew it was a complicated situation, but I also was.
Well, Jewish people were Democrats. That's what I knew for a long time.
Exactly. And so when someone said at the dinner, well, obviously it's the progressive thing to be pro-Palestine and to be anti-Israel. And I was like, oh, my ears and I was like, gosh, I realized I have a lot to learn about this issue, so.
Where are these ideas coming from in terms of the classroom?
So Hamid Deashi, he was the professor that taught my very first semester, contemporary Islamic civilization. I didn't know. I knew that he was a little bit, controversial. I had no idea the extent of it. He assigned a lot of readings by another Columbia scholar named Joseph Massad. And then, of course, we read a lot of Edward Said, and then we read Hamid Deashi's books. And Edward Said is kind of like the father of post-colonial theory. He wrote Orientalism back in 1978. He passed away, I think, in 2003, but he was a Columbia scholar, and he was like a spearheaded post-colonial theory in a lot of ways, and especially this concept of Orientalism. And so what I learned later was Hamid Deashi and Joseph Massad there was a documentary, I think in 2004 that it came out, created by Columbia students and graduates who were Jewish, who reported this alleged harassment that they had suffered at the hands of different professors, especially Joseph Massad. And Hamid Deashi was one of those professors, these, saying that, and they were just documenting and saying these experiences that they had with them. And they had gone to the, I think like the on-campus rabbi to kind of talk about these things. And he was interviewed in it as well. And, it was a really eye-opening thing. And the professors ended up writing, I think, responses to it in Columbia Spectator at the time. I did read those. But I mean, even in this film, at one point, Deashi was one of the professors that was talked about. And they have quotes that come on screen throughout this documentary. And one of them is Hamid Deashi. He wrote in a September 2004 article for an Egyptian newspaper, Al-Haram. He says, Al-Aram. He says, quote, "Half a century of systematic maiming and murdering of other people has left its deep mark on the faces of the Israeli Jews. The way they talk, walk, the way they greet each other. There is a vulgarity of character that is bone deep and structural to the skeletal vertebrae of its culture." Okay? So this is something written by this professor at Columbia. Joseph Massad, whose work we read, who's a post-colonial theorist. I think he's Palestinian himself. Hamid Deashi is Iranian American. And then he had said, at a 2002 lecture at Oxford, he had said the Jewish state is a racist state that does not have a right to exist. One of the students in the film said that, he called him one of the most dangerous intellectuals or self-proclaimed intellectuals on campus because he uses his classroom essentially as a platform for political propaganda. He said that Massad's one of his favorite things or ideas to say is the Palestinian is the new Jew and the Jew is the new Nazi. He said it's intellectually popular and justified nowadays to criticize Israel and to question its legitimacy. So this is going back, and this is like 2004 that this came out. So this is, one student had said that this lecture, Israeli student had maybe asked Joseph Massad a question, and Joseph Massad responded by saying, "How many Palestinians have you killed?" And he said, "Excuse me," and he said, "Tell me, how many Palestinian people have you killed?" And he said, "Well, if you're going to ask me that, then how many of your family members cheered on the day that 9/11, if we're going to talk stereotypes, And there was a lot of ruckus and something that this is what the student talks about in the film. Another student had said that I think his name's Saliba, who I didn't have and I don't know about. He had said to a Jewish student after class, allegedly, she was having this conversation with him for about 40 minutes. And he said, "Let me see your eyes." And he said, "See, you have either green or blue eyes. You're not a Semite. Therefore, you have no claim to that land." So there's a lot of really anti-Israel, really strong anti-Israel sentiment among the faculty. And it trickles down into the student body for sure. But that coupled with, students, I think colonialism and colonization is I probably heard that word and those words more than anything on campus, because it is about decolonizing, syllabi and decolonizing literature and decolonizing education and decolonizing lands. Before classes, people would give, Debashi himself would say, "Oh, we're on the Lenape Native American land." So honestly, to them, or to a lot of these folks who are taught that colonization, that Western colonization, colonialism is the scourge of the earth and it's wrought nothing but violence and devastation and oppression and slavery, etc., that, Israel in a lot of ways is seen as this modern, what they think is a colonizing nation. And so, divesting and, freeing the Palestinian people it's a leftist cause, because of that attitude that is so deep. It's so powerful.
We should say, so Barry Weiss, who is the founder of the Free Press, friend of mine, friend of, many of us, she gets criticized for all kinds of things. But, often, when you ask, like, what I call it Barry Weiss derangement syndrome. And, I ask people, well, what is it that she did? What is it exactly? And they go, "Oh, she tried to cancel people when she was at Columbia. That she's known for this. She tried to get a professor fired." And it always comes back to that. And nobody ever knows quite what it refers to exactly. And what I always say is, okay, well, you are the very people who are saying that college students are just college students and they shouldn't be held accountable for their ridiculous positions and beliefs. But sounds like what you're describing is probably exactly what she was responding to. I don't know exactly when she was at Columbia, but it makes sense that it would have been the early 2000s,
Yeah, and
possibly.
so exactly. And so that's the thing. When I was watching this documentary and when I was learning about all this, I thought, "Oh, this must be what she had either been involved in or she was adjacent to this."
Yeah, I think Edward Said was in the mix in some way.
Well, actually, Joseph Massad specifically. And so it's, to answer your question about that, about her specifically, is she actually just tweeted a few days ago, maybe 5 days ago, I'm not sure, something that Massad had written since the massacre on October 7th in Israel. And she said, "I was called a, hypocrite or much worse for telling the truth about this guy back when I was a Columbia student. This is what he had to say about that terrorist attack specifically." And it's not good. He said, I think he uses the word like awesome in it, or, just the I mean, he's here we go. She says on October 12th, Joseph Massad, the author of this piece, is a tenured professor at Columbia. I have been criticizing him since I was an undergrad and was accused of being a hysteric and worse for doing so. I was just listening to what he had to say. Read it for yourself. And it's on a website called electronicintifada.net. And on October 8th, the day after that massacre, he wrote this. Just Another Battle, or The Palestinian War of Liberation is the title of it. And, he talks about the surprise attack and, just the words that he uses and the way that he talks about it, not very sympathetic to what they endured there.
Are there like Jewish students in these classrooms?
Yeah.
Like responding? I mean, what, like I just said, I mean, there's a big Jewish population at Columbia and, presumably they enroll in Islamic studies courses. Does anybody ever say anything?
To be honest, I don't know how they do it. I don't know how. It's a fraught issue, and a lot of Jewish students have a really, really hard time with this culture and with this dialogue and the way that things are spoken about there. I mean, it's not easy. And yes, they are in these classes, and yes, they do volunteer their thoughts and say things. I'm sure that a lot of them stay quiet. I do know too that there's a faction of, and I don't know the extent of this, Meghan, but there are factions of, I think, Jewish students that are also part of like the pro-Palestinian cause, or that are kind of
right.
critical of Israel. But I mean, Israelis and Jews are critical of the Israeli government, and then not Yahoo all the world over, So there's criticism there. But yes, I know that a lot of Jewish students, but even in GS, the General Studies School, a number of the students that I met, I said that they were American U.S. mil vets. There were actually IDF soldiers, Israeli Defense Force soldiers that studied there. And so I can only imagine what they have been thinking and what they have been enduring since, if any of them are on campus, and what kind of interrogations they're getting from, because if you're an Israeli student, especially not just a Jewish student, but an Israeli student, you are a colonizer. And, Pamela Presky wrote about this in Sapir recently. And, she's talked about this before, and as have so many people, but it's about colonization, but it's also about whiteness. And Jewish people, Jewish Israelis, they're seen as white, and Palestinians are seen as people of color. And it's a white, to these reductive takes, it's a white race oppressing a brown skin race. And that's just how it is. In that article that Pamela Peresky just wrote, because I just read this like yesterday, but she mentioned something maybe a few years ago about how there was an activist that said to a lot of Black people, we see Jews as hyper whiteness or something.
It's amazing because Jews were not considered white up until pretty recently.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the thing. It's like they have been, one of the peoples that have, suffered the most white supremacist oppression. In this article that Pamela Presky wrote, she wrote Critical Race Theory and the, quote, hyper white Jew. And in it, she says, in the critical social justice paradigm, that is how Jews are viewed. Jews who have never been seen as white by those for whom being white is a moral good are now seen as white by those for whom whiteness is an unmitigated evil. And that kind of really sums it up pretty well. The dialogue and the discourse is so negative, and it's so divisive and so cynical. I mean, like, good God, I feel like I have been, an actively anti-racist person for most of my, if not all of my adult life. And when I came to Columbia and since then, and seeing the ways that people talk about whiteness and white people, it's not like this thing there. I think, oh my gosh, I'm so offended, like that they're talking about me and my, but I was so kind of just floored. I'm like, I can't believe that people are talking like this. Like, did we not learn anything from reducing people to the color of their skin? Like, how is this not the most regret? I can't believe this is happening again. And when I would see people posting things on Twitter and, hearing things I'm like, this is going to be studied, because in 100 years, if we're still around, people are going to look back and they're going to be looking at this and they're going to be like, I can't believe Americans did that again. I can't believe that it was one drop rule, in the antebellum, pre-Civil War era, And then suddenly we're going back to these people are white and these people are black and these people are white adjacent and these people are practicing whiteness, you know? And these kind of affinity groups that they're doing where they're separating people by race. Like, again, going back to the one drop rule, I'm taking this African American literature course at Columbia with this brilliant professor. Of course, we're reading Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston and all these things. And Toni Morrison's always been one of my favorite authors. And we're like learning, of course, a lot about African American history, especially U.S. history. And I'm seeing how, these things are being said and, these racial preferences and dividing people into affinity groups. And I'm like, who decides who's black? Like, are we going to go back to this one drop rule? Like, who decides who's white and who's black? I mean, it's not the easiest thing to just divide people down these arbitrary lines of race. And I just thought, good God, what are we doing? It's terrifying and it's still scary. And what we see now happening on campuses with all of these students rising up to protest and support Palestine. Now, at Columbia, there was a protest just a few days ago, or I think on Friday maybe, or Thursday, I'm sorry, in the afternoon. And it took over like the whole quad there. And it was a lot of pro-Israel students on one side, and then, of course, a lot of Palestinian students, pro-Palestine, on the other. And I think the Israeli students headed out earlier. The pro-Palestine went even longer, and then they kind of rolled around campus in different places off campus and so on. They're just to them, it's a righteous cause, and it's really a part of the belief system that they've adopted.
Well, who had more on that day?
That's a good question. When I look at the pictures, it looks like they're pretty even, so I'm not really sure.
Okay, so that's interesting because I'm not seeing that online. I'm seeing on Twitter just, one after the other Free Palestine rallies on campuses. I'm not seeing the Jewish kids. I'm not seeing the pro-Israel side.
That's what they mostly are. And again, I wasn't there, so I actually walked past the campus. But they were checking IDs to go in. And I probably could have gone in because I have an alumni ID. But anyway, I didn't realize that this protest was going on. But when I did look at the picture that was posted in Columbia Spectator, it did look, if they were describing it accurately, like, oh, pro-Palestine, that's on this side, pro-Israel, it's on that side. It seemed like it was pretty even. But again, that was just a really quick view, and I have no idea. Obviously, we're not seeing a lot of pro-Israel protests on campus. We're seeing mostly pro-Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, if it's that many at Columbia, you can imagine elsewhere. What is it like for conservative students on campus? I mean, there's always been there's the Republicans, the student Republicans and the Federalist Society and all that. Like, do they just tend to keep their mouths shut? Like, are they just like off in their corner somewhere doing their own thing?
So funny because, yeah, in a way. It's just so funny to think. I mean, before I went to Columbia, it was right after Trump was elected. And I was like, okay, I know I'm doing this pep talk to myself. I know I'm going to encounter some conservative people there and I just have to keep my mouth shut. And it was like the total opposite. I never would have in a million years thought it would be the opposite. I mean, I knew that it wasn't going to be overrun with conservatives, but I was kind of trying to prepare myself to kind of steel myself against these conservative talking points that I was like allergic to at the time. So, yeah, they are pretty quiet. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when you say that, like what happens to the conservative kids, I think of this guy, Julian von Abel, who you might even recognize his name. You've probably heard it because it was a viral incident that happened in, I think, maybe December 2019 at Columbia, where he was maybe a sophomore or junior. He's a physics student, geeky guy, white guy, glasses. And I believe he was drunk. I think that was reported because it was like at 2:00 in the morning or 3:00 in the morning in front of Butler Library there on Columbia's campus, which is right in the main part of campus there. And he was on video saying how, the Western, what did he say? The West created the world. And I love white people, and we invented science, and we, going on this like pro West.
Maybe somebody roofied him.
Jumping up and down, right? Result. And of course, there's this group of students around him, all having their cameras out, recording him, and it's them against him. And I think it was maybe like 6, 8, or 8 students. And they're yelling, say it again. And they're saying, this and that. And he's saying, and they're like, and he's like, I love all people. I'm not racist. I love white people, but I love white people too. And just going off. And, of course, the next day we get the letter from the administrators that they're shocked by the white supremacist discourse. There was an incident that left so many people rattled and afraid. And, he was seen as this kid who was just the epitome of Trumpism, white supremacy, etc. Colin Friedersdorf for The Atlantic.
Connor Friedersdorf.
Connor,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Connor Friedersdorf ended up interviewing him because he was really curious about this months later and kind of getting his take. And this guy was like, he had been pro-Obama. He was just, he was conservative. I think what he had reacted to, according to these reports and what he said, was they were saying that if you support Trump, you support sexual assault or something like that. And he was like, I don't at all. And then that was kind of how it started. And then, he started kind of jumping up and down and doing this pro-Western civilization thing. And they're egging him on, and it's this big thing. But my reaction to it, you said, well, what are the conservative kids doing? To me, it's Newton's third law. It's like, I think it's the third law, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's like, of course, this kid is going to get drunk. And when he gets drunk, he's going to go, because what other reaction are people going to have when they're sitting in these classes all day, listening to all of this anti-West, white people are evil and the scourge of the earth kind of discourse? I mean, what else are you? It gets to a point where it's going to make you depressed, or it's going to make you reactive. It's going to make you a whole bunch of different things. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say this. I don't even know if I should say this to you, but I'm going to anyway. I remember, around that time, probably 2019, I remember I excelled at Columbia. I did really well. I don't regret any of it. It was a great experience because I really did learn a lot. It was a huge privilege to be there, but I had a really hard time depression wise. It was scary. It was a stressful period. And I've had a lot of identity crises while I was there. But I remember kind of daydreaming at home, and being like, I'm just going to go into Times Square and I'm going to put a sign in front of me and that says Cis White Guy, and just light myself on fire.
Oh, goodness.
Just self-immolate, because would be best for everyone. And this is what, that was kind of how dark my thoughts got at some point. And in truth, I was suicidal when I was at Columbia. I hadn't been for years and years and years. And I was in therapy at the time, and we had to devise a plan to, I had to stand at the top of the subway steps rather than on the platform, just in case I was tempted to jump, when I was going into school, because that was how it just was such an alienating feeling. And it was just, and it was sad. And it was weird because I saw, so many people there that professed to kind of have the same ideals that I had or did still have, and going about it in this way that was so backwards and so divisive. And obviously not just for white people, but for Black people and for brown people and for people of all orientations and backgrounds. The way that it was harming and painting entire groups and populations of people as monoliths, and just these reductive takes and these very bigoted, and honestly neo-racist ideas that were framed as anti-racist, floored me. I couldn't believe it. And it was a culture shock. And it really, of course, the result was I had to really go inward and say, okay, where do all these ideas come from? Where do these beliefs come from? And I had to do my own research and really because that's me. I can't
do your own research. That's
yeah. Well, I can't.
That's
me. I can't sit with it. I have to get answers, and I can't run away from stuff. I have to look at it and really get, what is this? What is going on? I'm curious, and I want to get to the bottom of it.
Were there back channel conversations going on with people? I mean, you say you felt totally alone, but you couldn't have been the only one. One thing I've noticed is that, there's the kind of public facing narrative, and then there's everybody whispering, in the wings. Were you having any of those kinds of conversations with people?
My one friend who was the Hare Krishnan cult survivor, he and I would have some uncensored conversations that were really helpful. They were few and far between, but they were helpful. My closest friend was a black man. He was like 50, gay black man, lived in Brooklyn for years and years. He was my closest friend. He, Meghan, was more problematic than I was. I mean, the things that would come out of his mouth were like, about all of this kind of stuff. So I could speak freely to him, but he kind of, he was very, very vocal to me. And he was, when I would kind of kind of confess or profess these kind of ideas to him or share something that I had written, he'd be like, Ben, you have to speak out about this. You have to talk about this. Like we need this. And again, that's what I'm going back to, is this kind of thing that's not just white people. It's like a lot of black students I knew were like, I actually kind of agree with, it's people are people. We have, there's just no way can you assume what happens inside the minds of somebody and inside the brain of somebody just on the color of their skin? It's really, it's awful. It's like, didn't we learn that in kindergarten?
Yeah. Well, I was also thinking, I was wondering, is it your friend who was in his 50s, was it easier for him to speak up because at least he's black, he has that, but it's actually harder. Exactly. Like, this is why I always say, why are there so few, for example, black women in this kind of heterodox free speech space? Because, you're an apostate, you get it both ways, right? It's like that you're going to be thrown out by the women as well as the black people.
Right. I mean, there were times, and as the time went on at Columbia and my classes, I became more uncensored in class. I did become more, and I would, oh my God, the way that I would couch these things, like just, I recognize that I'm very privileged, or whatever. I mean, not to that point, but just like, because, it happens once, it happened again. I mentioned that thing that happened in contemporary, then it happened in a lesbian and gay history course that I was taking. It was just like these little things you kind of learn and you're like, oh, okay, well, I really have to, to qualify here. But there were people that would come up to me after class privately and say, I totally agree with, and they would share an experience or share something, a similar idea that they had about something. I knew that there was. And it might have even, you know what, Meghan, it might be the majority of students, who knows? But that red guard and that capture is so strong and so scary that, I don't know what the percentages are. I don't know how many people are still thinking for themselves and how many people are not. And they've just turned off their brains and they've really learned how to capitalize on being a part of that mob and that mob mentality. But one other example, I had met a guy, I won't say his name. I don't think he would even mind, but he was in the School of General Studies as well. He was studying the arts. Really nice guy, really sweet, just docile guy, straight guy. And we had gotten friendly, at an event. And then I ran into him off campus some months later. It was maybe like the second time that I ever met him. And I said, "Hey, how are you?" And he said, "Good." And I happened to say to him, "How are you in Colombia?" And he said, "I've started having panic attacks in class." And his face was so red, and I felt so bad for him because he was it just came out. And I said, "Oh God!" And right away I was like, "I probably know what And he said, "Yeah, I'm just terrified of." He's like, "I had this experience where these people screamed at me, and he explained the situation. He had a black female student had spoken about the professional world and maybe said something about how she was concerned or worried about the, making it in the professional world after she left and or something. And he, being an older student who had worked in the professional world, he volunteered and said, "You know what? Honestly, everybody feels like that. You're going to do great. And everybody's just kind of faking it until they make it," something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then another black student said, "I don't know what we have to listen to a white guy talk to a black girl about, how it's going to be, and, said this really, derogatory stuff. And he just went completely red. And he was like, and the professor was a Black professor. Did he say anything? No. Afterwards, did my friend, this guy that I knew, did he get an email from the professor? Yes. And guess what that Black professor said? I do not stand by what those students were saying. That is not how I feel. That is not a good representation. But he said nothing in the class.
Oh my gosh.
And so
infuriating.
He started having panic attacks, And he would say too, he was like, it just gets really tiring because when people say he's in these writing classes or whatever, and he's like, and they're like, oh, just what we like, he would be the only guy in a class. And there were a lot of classes where I was the only guy. Absolutely. Because I'm studying writing there and there's a lot of women. And, he would say it just gets really tiring when you're in a class of 12 people and like someone makes a joke and the professor laughs and says like, oh yeah, just like what we need, like another mediocre white guy writing blah, blah, blah. And then they would kind of look at him and say like, oh, sorry, no offense,
God.
And it's like, with all of this talk about microaggressions, it's like, that's just, if that's not a microaggression, I don't know what is.
It's just lazy. It's lazy cliche.
But it's also like, it's blatantly discriminatory language. And for all the talk that we hear about microaggressions and about speaking right and honoring people that are different, it's very weird to be encountering that and then to see it so blatantly and acceptably violated those kind of unspoken or no, really spoken roles, violated just carelessly, and then being applauded or just okayed. Again, a lot of that is rooted in the curriculum. It's a weird thing with this core curriculum. Classes have to do with Western civilization, masterpieces of Western literature and contemporary Western civilization, and it is a lot about reading, the greats in the Western canon and so on. So it's a weird duality to be, encountering this stuff and then to go to your next class and they're like, oh, the West is shit. It's a very weird experience.
Yeah, well,
it's a weird thing.
Whiplash. Yeah. Well, Ben, I want to keep you a little bit over time for our paying subscribers. But I mean, my last question, I wonder how you feel about this. Are you optimistic that this is going to change? So I've got this like kind of ongoing difference of viewpoint with my podcast partner, Sarah Hayter, on my other podcast. Like she's very, very pessimistic about the future of these institutions. And she thinks that there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. We're not going to get out of this alive. I think that this is such nonsense that it is not sustainable. I mean, we're seeing all the time, it's being chipped away at. I think especially this situation with Israel has been a wake-up call for a lot of people who were just kind of, standing by, nodding along. But when you're seeing this level of anti-Semitism coming from elite, supposedly liberal, enlightened, educated sects of society, it's shocking. And in fact, we just had at the University of Pennsylvania, we just had a major donor, John Huntsman, say that he was not going to be giving one more dollar because of the response to the situation in Israel. I have to think it will have an effect. But what do you think?
I mean, I do too. I think it will have I don't know. Maybe we're at a tipping point. Maybe we're at a watershed moment. I have no idea. I'm more in line, like you were saying about Sarah Hayter, your co-host on your other podcast, that you said that she is more pessimistic and cynical about it. I'm typically in that lane as well. Yes, I agree with you, Meghan. It's not sustainable, but it's so deeply rooted and it's complex. And I think that I don't know.
But what's going to happen? Like, there's going to be no more college? Like, what is the alternative? We can't keep going this way. I mean, it is a self-annihilating way of being in the world.
So I don't know how to answer it. I guess it's just like what's really interesting to me and what I've been thinking about is like, it's weird. The U.S. is a very strange place because you're not supposed to say this. You can't say it's racist, I think, to say we're a melting pot, right? So we're a multicultural, we're a nation of immigrants, right? But the U.S. is the one place where in your universities, you can have like the most like blatantly anti-American and anti-Western professors and being tenured, and being employed and talking and speaking. I mean, do you think that an anti-Iranian, American could go and teach at the University of Tehran? I mean, it's weird that we have that, in a lot of ways, and I'm not just talking about, the Iranian professors, whatever. I'm just saying, like, the call is coming from inside the house. It's
Yeah, and the house is going to self-destruct, I feel like, or it's just going to lose its currency. Like, I mean, how valuable is a Harvard education at this point?
Exactly.
The corporations aren't going to stand for it anymore. It's really follow the money.
Right. Precisely. That's precise. It's going to be follow the money. And, but see it's worked in a lot of ways because of, like, for lack of a better phrase, or term, woke capitalism, because it has been lucrative and profitable, but it's not going to stay that way. And so I think that, you might be right, that money is going to turn it around.
And I don't think it has been that profitable. I mean, go woke, go broke. They've been saying for the last several years.
Yeah.
I think that there's been an illusion of profitability.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's been mostly fashion.
You're probably right.
It's very. I wonder if this is like an age thing because, Sarah and I are 20 years apart in age. You and I are not that far apart in age, or not 20 years anyway. And I just feel like people who are very young, who haven't known any other way, they have only seen universities be this way. They have only seen news organizations and the media like this. They don't know of an NPR that was like an intelligent, nuanced, like really super interesting thing to listen to. There's a reason that we used to listen to it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if that's part of it. I mean, maybe I'm naive. Many people say I am, but I worry that there's going to be an overcorrection, if anything, and we're just going to just react in really unproductive ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a lot of people. I mean, that's a very legitimate and very real concern. People are like, what happens when, there's this an authoritarian comes in, totalitarianism comes in. And that's why, we have to worry about people like Trump and people, I mean, Trump did break a lot of people's brains. In a lot of ways, he broke my brain. I mean, he broke, with everything that happened. It's just, I think that, again, going back to that idea where I think about this a lot, this kind of Newton's law of, like, equal and opposite reaction. It's like when you have this radical stuff or when this big thing, you're going to get kind of the equal and opposite reaction to it. Trump was a huge, like, he was in a lot of ways a blessing to a lot of these leftist radicals because it was this excuse to just go balls to the wall.
Yeah.
And then the way that they reacted, then it was the right to go balls to the wall. I mean, it was just, we're bouncing and ping-ponging back and forth. And it's going to be, so yeah, that's not sustainable because people are just going to tire of it, but I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah. Well, all right. I'm going to keep you for some overtime. But in the meantime, Ben, thank you so much for coming on at the last minute and talking about this. I'll have you back when your book comes out. But,
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Okay. And now for something completely different. Gender. We don't talk about it enough around here. So actually, I knew we were going to talk about Israel, Palestine today, but I also had noticed a tweet that I sent you having to do with the relationship between gay men and gender identity ideology. Somebody wrote, I don't know who this is. They wrote, I'm so sad to objectively note that a lot of the propagation of gender identity ideology is done by gay men. It's almost an obsession of mine, this person is saying, to find out why. I would really like to find psychologists, sociologists to look into this thoroughly. Add your possible explanation below. And then a number of people chimed in. Somebody said, well, the same person said, having been bullied before for being feminine, they think they're protecting other feminine men. Gay men love women, feel safe around women, often share deep conversations, but they have little clue about female anatomy and underestimate the importance of privacy for women. Okay, what do you have to say about this?
Yeah, those are a couple good points. I have had this conversation with a number of people, and I feel like everybody has a different opinion on why gay men are responsible, or so a lot of gay men are responsible for kind of propagating gender identity ideology. And
it's women. I would put it in order. I would put women and then gay men.
Yeah, and so Yeah, like I would say maybe I think so. Yeah, I would agree with that.
That was my conversation with Ben Appel, along with a little taste of the second portion of our conversation. If you want to hear that portion, become a paying subscriber at meghandom.substack.com. That is the way you support this podcast. It gets you all kinds of bonus content. If you join at the founding member level, you can join me for a Zoom hangout on Sunday, October 29th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time. And more importantly, you can hear the rest of this conversation, which is pretty juicy and fascinating. And it is with Ben Appel, who is a writer living in New York. His memoir, Cis White Gay, The Making of a Gender Heretic, it's what we're going to be talking about in that second portion, is forthcoming. His work has appeared in Newsweek, Spiked, Daily Mail, Washington Examiner, Queer Majority, and UnHerd. What else do you need to know? I think that's it for now. I've given you a lot. I will be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you then.